Lately, I've been getting questions about how I approach the essay portion of the bar exam. A few years ago, I had to conquer the California bar exam myself, so I wanted to come here to share tips and tricks on studying for the bar. I've been providing daily tips on my TikTok account, and I'll also be posting additional bar tips on my YouTube channel, so subscribe so you don't miss out on any future bar exam tips. For me, studying for the essay portion of the bar exam comes down to 3 things: memorizing, strategizing, and building up endurance. Before we start getting into my study plan, I do want to take a step back and talk about what the essay portion of the bar exam is. For most states, the essay portion takes place on the first day of the bar exam. If you're taking the California bar exam, you're going to have 5 subject matter essays in which you'll have an hour to do each. So morning session day 1, you're going to have 3 hours to complete 3 essays. Each one of those essays is going to be approximately 100 points. The afternoon session of day 1, you're going to have 3.5 hours. During those 3.5 hours, you're going to have 2 subject matter essays to complete, as well as a performance test. The 2 subject matter essays are each worth 100 points, and the performance test is worth 200 points. Like I discussed before, I'm going to be primarily focused on the subject matter essays for this video, but I do want to share one quick tip about the PTs, which is that for me, what I did was that I answered the PT before I answered the 2 subject matter questions. So for me, if I was going to have any sort of timing issues, I wanted those timing issues to not happen during the performance test, because every missed point is double for the performance test. The second reason I did this is because the performance test requires you to review a new case that they present to you, review a more detailed fact scenario. You're going between multiple documents, and that requires a different level of focus. And for me, my best level of focus always happened at the beginning of the sessions. Whereas when I was answering one of the subject matter essays, I was a little bit more on autopilot, because really it's one fact pattern. The questions themselves are a little bit more narrow, so you're kind of on autopilot. And if you're ever getting in the circumstance where you're running out of time, at least you're running out of time on a question that's worth less points. This is not going to work for everyone, and this very much was part of my strategizing. If you're taking the UBE, day 1 will consist of 2 sessions. The morning session will be 3 hours long, where you'll be required to answer 2 MPT questions. This is the Multistate performance test, which means that you have 90 minutes to answer each Multistate performance test. None of this requires subject matter knowledge memorized. This is all kind of testing your lawyering ability by asking you to do a particular task. In most states, the MPT is going to be worth 20% of your score. You'll be graded on a 1 to 6 grading scale, but some states have a different grading scale slightly. It can be like 1 to 10 in some states, so I would double check with your state requirement. The afternoon session on day 1 is when the MEE occurs, the Multistate Essay Exam. For the Multistate Essay Exam, you're going to have 3 hours to complete 6 essays, which means that you're going to have about 30 minutes each. Generally, in order to pass the California bar exam, you have to have an average essay score of about 62 points, which means that if you're achieving higher than a passing score on the MBE, you can afford to have less points on the essay portion of the exam and still pass. Likewise, if you're struggling with the MBE and are not achieving a passing score on the MBE, it puts a little bit more pressure on you to perform on the essays. What a passing score is for the UBE really depends on what state, because the passing score itself will depend on the state. But generally, if you're trying to achieve a passing score in some of the highest jurisdictions, you should try to aim to have an average of at least a 4.2 on the 6 scale. Okay, now let's get down on how I practice. Practicing for the essay portion of the bar exam is so important. It's important that you start practicing as soon as possible. So if you've been nervous up to this point that you have not memorized enough black letter law, I really want you to let go of that fear, and I want you to start practicing. In practicing for the essay portion of the bar exam, you're trying to really achieve 3 different goals. 1 is memorization, 2, strategizing, and 3, endurance. All 3 of these goals are super important in order to be successful on the bar exam. Let's start with memorization. While it's impossible to know for sure which essays are going to be on the next administration of the bar exam, there are ways that you can make strategic decisions on which subjects you prioritize in terms of memorization. It is well known what the highly tested topics are for the UBE and the California bar exam, and you can use these lists of highly tested subjects in order to prioritize which subjects you're going to spend the most time on. Now, I want to be clear here, I am not suggesting that you skip any sort of topic. This is a recipe for disaster. You want to be able to achieve a passable score on every single subject. I linked below to a website that lists all the highly tested subjects out for both the UBE and California, so check that out. After you've identified the highly tested topics, it's also important to go through the questions themselves. This is going to allow you to not only identify the highly tested subjects, but what topics within those subjects tend to be tested most frequently. And this is why I say you should start practicing from day one. If you wait until you've reviewed your entire outline and have that memorized, what you're doing is you're preventing yourself from being able to review the practice essays and actually identify what actually matters. Strategy to focus on the highly tested topics is the other reason why I've always recommended to start and focus on the MBE subjects. It is guaranteed that at least one MBE subject is going to show up in your essays, regardless of whether or not you're in California or you're in a UBE state. For most of you, the MBE is going to be worth at least 50% of your bar exam score, which means if you prioritize the MBE subjects, you're going to have a good knowledge of over 50% of the content of the exam, and in some cases, well over 50%. Okay, now let's get into more detail about how I actually practiced. I would do practice essays is by doing an entire essay under time conditions. So 60 minutes to do the best I could to answer the questions. I know this is really scary, but it's really important for you to start doing this. It's incredible how your fingers honestly develop some sort of muscle memory as you're starting to type up some of these rules. The more of these essays I was doing, the faster I was typing up the rules. I wanted to experience the feeling of being nervous about the fact that I couldn't think about the perfect recitation of a rule. And I wanted my brain to be comfortable with that feeling of being nervous, overcoming that, and then pulling words out of my brain in order to eventually form the answer. Because on the bar exam, you're going to be nervous and you're going to just have to figure it out. And I wanted to train my body and my brain to have that sort of anxiety and, take a step back and just figure it out and put an answer on the page. All right, let's get into how I would answer practice essays. The first thing I would do is I would look at the call of the question. That is how I train myself to answer every single California essay. I think it's really important to start with the questions because you want to be able to identify what subject they're testing before you start reading through the fact pattern. And you also want to know not just what subject they're testing, but what they're actually asking you to answer. The biggest trap people run into for the essays is they don't answer the actual call of the question. They get distracted with all these red herrings that come up in the fact pattern. When you start with the question, it allows you to go through the fact pattern and move past those red herrings so that you just stay focused on what the bar examiners are actually asking you to analyze. Okay, the next thing I would do is I would go ahead and read the actual fact pattern. It's really important to do a good close read and develop some sort of annotation strategy that you may have. Some states allow you to bring highlighters in the exam, so I know people who have, highlighter color coding pattern. For me, that personally took a little bit too much time, so I developed some sort of circle underline method when I was going through the prompt, and that was really helpful for me. The next thing I would do is I would type out all my issue headings and my rule statements. My personal strategy was I would do this first before I actually went into the analysis and conclusion stage. Some people may disagree with this strategy, so honestly, this is why you have to practice because you have to see if this strategy works for you. It may not. If it doesn't work for you, you can go ahead and do the full IRAC analysis from the start. Issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. For me, this was the best way to organize all the issues for that particular essay question and making sure I had words on a page as fast as possible. My biggest concern was that I would panic towards the end of a question, and as a result, I would miss some sort of issue. The way I rationalize this is that for me, when I was answering essay questions, answering an essay question required using different skills in my brain. So for the issue and the rule, it was really about recall and, pulling information from my brain. I would also tend to memorize things in groups. So by just focusing on the rules all at once, it allowed me to actually remember things a little bit better because as I was typing it out, I was typing it out in a way that it was already appearing in my outline. And I was able to have that recall happen without interrupting kind of that train of thought and flow by inserting the analysis. I noticed that when I did this, I was able to identify more issues and type the rules a lot faster. For me, this was also the best way for me to start developing my muscle memory. It's one thing to be able to say you have a rule memorized and can recite it out loud as you're walking. It's a completely different thing to be able to type out a rule. So after I was able to type out the issues and rules, then I would just do the analysis real quick, the conclusion, and I'd get out. And when I say I was writing out the issue and rule statements, I mean I was writing out the issues exactly how I would do it on bar exam day, which meant for the issues I was underlining or bolding, and for particularly dense rule statements, I was either breaking them out or I was bolding. Why was I doing this? Bar exam graders tend to be practicing attorneys who are pretty busy. I once went to a workshop where I saw a California bar exam grader say that it generally took him 2 to 3 minutes to grade a California essay. Yeah, you heard that right, 2 to 3 minutes. How are they able to do that quickly? They make quick judgment calls on how well you performed on the exam. Now, what does this mean? This means that you have an incredibly short time frame to grab their attention. You have to make the answer as easy to read as possible and as organized as possible. There's some really good resources for strategies for how to approach the essay and the performance test version of the bar exam. I'll put links to those resources below. But pretty much the main takeaway from all of these resources is, one, you want to make it as easy as possible for the bar examiner to be able to determine that you've hit all the issues. 2, make it equally as easy for them to see that you are able to recite the rules, and make it pretty clear that you're able to do enough analysis to show a basic competence to be able to perform as a lawyer. The next thing I do is I take a look at the model answer just to make sure I hit all the issues and to make sure I was characterizing the rules correctly. One important thing to note is that you do not have to write out the rule verbatim as it appears in the model answer. A lot of the times this is the most complete version of the rule, but it tends to be really, really long. In my experience, memorizing those really long-winded rule statements was really difficult. So what I would do is I would rewrite the rule in a way in which I would be able to more easily memorize it. Pretty much my goal was to memorize less. So how could I write this rule in as few words as possible so that I can both memorize it faster and also be able to more quickly type it out on bar exam day. Once I finished my time practice essay, I would go ahead and save it just so I had a copy of that practice. But then after that, what I would do is I would take out all of the analysis and conclusions and I would leave the issues and rule statements. And to be clear, I would leave the issues and rule statements as I rewrote them to be able to more easily memorize. So this essay template was added to the materials that I would review when I was just doing my refreshing review of that subject for a particular week. When you start doing this after a couple of times, you're going to start seeing that there are definitely patterns to some of these essays depending on the subject. And what's really nice is that you're going to start seeing how some of these subtopics or these MEE subjects start coming together and how they're ordered. And it's one thing to memorize the black letter law from an outline, but it's another thing to memorize it from an essay template. Having these essay templates as an additional form to study off of, I think is really useful for me because I'm a visual learner. I was able to kind of see how the issues would look together and be organized in a particular essay question. So for some reason I was stuck and I had no idea what to write on the bar exam. I would kind of look back to, okay, so is there one issue I can identify? And then I would identify that and I would kind of think to myself, well, when from the other essay templates, what other issues were usually tested with that other issue? And then suddenly it would come in my head and I would start seeing one of the essay templates just kind of appear in my brain as I was trying to recall what I'd been studying. And it would start coming together little by little. Some of you asked how many practice timed essays I did. And honestly, this really varied based off of where I was in my bar studying. I tried, if I could, to do at least one timed essay every single day, or at least weekday if I could, just to get one in. And then I would usually do at least one other, what I like to call skeleton outline. So pretty much what I would do when I would create a skeleton essay is I would kind of go through the original steps of reading the question prompt, reading the fact pattern, and then trying to write out all the issues and rules. And I would stop there. I wouldn't just do the analysis. And what was nice about this is it allowed me to pretty much spend half the time on that particular review. So instead of doing an hour on a full practice timed essay, I was able to squeeze in 2 essay reviews during that time because the only focus was on making sure I could issue spot, making sure I had a strategy for reading the facts section, and making sure I could write out and practice typing up the rules. That way I was still working on my memorization, I was still working on my recall, and I was working on really getting that muscle memory of some of these, commonly used rules in. For a lot of you, I think right now you're kind of at the midpoint of your bar review. At this point, you should definitely be doing at least one timed essay a day, and maybe doing 1 or 2 skeleton outline versions of the essays in addition to that. Doing both the full-time practice essays as well as the skeleton version of the essays really helped me with both my memorization as well as my strategy. Strategizing how I was going to read a question prompt, strategizing how I was going to annotate the fact pattern, strategizing with how I would go ahead and format or type out a particular essay. People have different methods of approaching the essay portion of the bar exam, so it's really important that you try different things out during practice to be able to figure out what works for you to most effectively perform on the essay portion of the bar. Earlier I mentioned the need to work on endurance. This is incredibly important. It's one thing to spend 1 hour on one timed essay. It's something completely different to have to be in complete focus for 3 hours straight and do back-to-back-to-back essays and switch subjects. So later into my bar exam studying, what I would do is I would actually do kind of mini bars where I would practice this doing 3 hours worth of essays. So on a given Saturday, I would wake up in the morning, and then at 9 a.m., from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. pretty much, I did 3 essays in 3 hours. Please, please, please do not wait for the bar exam for it to be the first time you attempt to do 3 essays in a row. It is exhausting and it is really difficult to switch your brain between subjects. Remember what the goal is for the essay portion of the bar exam. If you're in California, you need to be able to write the best answer that you can within 60 minutes. If you're in a UBE state, then you need to be able to write the best answer you can in 30 minutes. You train yourself for that, and then you figure out how to move on. Quick side note to this timing issue, it's really important that you make sure you know what the rules are and what types of watches or timers you can bring into the bar. In California, we were not allowed to bring in digital watches. Certainly not an Apple Watch, but even like just a regular digital watch you weren't allowed to bring in. You had to bring in just an analog watch. And there were some people that assumed that there would be a clock in the room. Those people were put at a huge disadvantage because while I think there might have been one clock at the very front of the room, you're in a very large convention center for these bar exams. And it's unlikely that you're going to be able to see it, which means that you need to make sure that you not only have a watch with you on bar exam day, but that it complies with the rules, which you can find on the bar website. And when you're doing your practice essays, that you're incorporating that watch into your bar exam studying. Down below, I put a link to like one possible analog watch you can use, but honestly, I don't care if you buy that one in particular. Just buy some sort of timing device that is compliant with what your state requires. Something that I did the second that the bar exam started is what I did is I would write the start time, and then I would write the times that I had to move on to essay 2 and essay 3. So if the exam was starting at 9:05, literally the first thing I did before I opened the essay book was I wrote 10:05, 11:05, 12:05. So there was no question about when it was time for me to just move on. I know right now that studying for the essays might seem overwhelming, but honestly, you're gonna be okay. And for me personally, the best part of the bar was when day 1 was over and I didn't have to worry about the essays anymore. Because day 2 is just the MBE. And the nice thing about the MBE is that you know which subjects are gonna be tested and the answer is there in front of you on the page. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments and subscribe to my channel for more bar exam tips.